Good morning. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I am a psychiatrist, and so you might wonder, why am I talking about histamine intolerance? But before I go forward, I'm at least financially unconflicted. So why should we care about histamine intolerance? Why am I talking about it? By the end of the talk, I hope to convince all of you it's worth thinking about, even if you haven't before. I developed a number of health problems in my early 40s. I'm now 51. And things like fibromyalgia and IBS and migraines and chronic fatigue sort of all of a sudden or gradually over the period of a few months. And through a process of trial and error, I determined that I was able to remove all of these symptoms, resolve all of them, simply by changing my diet to really a mostly meat diet, which scared me to death because I thought it would kill me. So then I became really fascinated by food and how it affects the body, and started reading and studying, writing, learning about food and food chemistry. So I'm particularly fascinated by the chemistry of low carbohydrate diets. I eat a ketogenic diet myself, and food sensitivities, of which I have many. So I hope histamine intolerance is a food sensitivity. One of the reasons why it's so important for everyone to know about is because if we can just take a minute to soak in this list of symptoms that histamine intolerance can cause, it's really striking. Everything from migraine headaches to menstrual symptoms to fatigue, insomnia, asthma, allergy symptoms. These things seemingly have nothing in common, but what can draw all of them together for quite a few people is the molecule histamine. At least 1% of people have histamine intolerance, but it's probably, as the case with most food sensitivities, much higher than that. Because most food sensitivities, they're hard to recognize as an individual, they're hard to document, and they're hard to study. At least 80% of people who have histamine intolerance are middle-aged, so most cases of histamine intolerance are acquired and not genetic. So what is histamine intolerance? It is sensitivity to any food which is not absolutely fresh. So as soon as a plant or an animal stops being alive, bacteria in the environment descend upon it and begin to dine. And when that happens, they create, as byproducts of protein metabolism, histamine and other biogenic amines. So all of the foods in this picture, for example, this wasn't accidental bacterial contamination. Humans went out of their way to add bacteria to fresh meat and dairy products to create fermented foods. So all of these foods contain some histamine and other biogenic amines. Beef is an interesting example because beef, you pay a lot of money for aged beef, which is a very trendy delicacy right now, hangs for months often while bacteria break down the muscle fibers in the meat, and aged beef is loaded with histamine and other biogenic amines. And in fact, beef is one of the few animal products that at least I have not been able to find absolutely fresh, because the tradition, at least in this country, is to hang beef for at least 2 weeks before it even goes to market. So it's very hard to find fresh beef. And to make matters worse, there's kind of a trendy fermentation fad going on right now, made popular by the GAPS diet. We're told that fermented foods, because they're teeming with live bacteria, can replenish the bacteria in our gut which may be missing. And so, for example, if we think about adding, the way I think about food is we don't just want to think about something in it some ingredient in it that might be good for us. We have to think about what else is in that food. Yes, this food contains bacteria, and yes, it may or may not make it down to your gut, and it may or may not survive there, and it may not be helpful, but what else is in that food? And so if you change from a traditional, conventional diet to something like a paleo or keto or low-carb GAPS diet, and you don't feel better, or if you actually feel worse, it's worth thinking about what foods have you added to your diet that you weren't accustomed to eating before, which may be making you feel worse. And this is how I stumbled upon my own histamine intolerances. I had been eating a mostly meat ketogenic diet, mostly meat diet for a while, and had been feeling pretty good. And then I embarked on a ketogenic diet and had to travel for a conference, and was relying on a lot more preserved meats than I usually would have for convenience, and I started to feel worse. And someone pointed out to me I might have this condition, and they were right. So histamine is just one of a variety of biogenic amines. And what a biogenic amine is it's a signaling molecule in the body. So you take an amino acid, a garden variety building block of a protein, and you, by adding an enzyme to it, you can transform it into a powerful signaling molecule. So our bodies do this on purpose all the time. Our bodies use histamine for very important things. And so these powerful signaling molecules are used to regulate things like cell growth, to trigger hormone release, and to regulate nerve cell activity. When we're making biogenic amines like histamine, we're doing it on purpose in tiny amounts at just the right time and in just the right place in order to do something specific. And then as soon as it has finished doing its job, as soon as the biogenic amine has attached to its receptor and sent its signal, we instantly destroy it with a neutralizing enzyme. In our bodies, usually it's HNMT, histamine and methyltransferase in the case of histamine, so that it won't accumulate and travel through the bloodstream willy-nilly and create havoc with our organ systems. So we're going to focus on histamine rather than the other biogenic amines because histamine is profoundly connected to food sensitivities, and the rest of them, for the most part, aren't. There are some exceptions, which you can ask me about later if you want. But histamine, the parent amino acid that we make histamine out of is histidine. That's the amino acid. And then we use an enzyme called histidine decarboxylase to create histamine. And then histamine can attach to one of 4 different kinds of receptors. There are various cells within our body, not just mast cells, which we associate with allergic responses from histamine. There are other specialized cells within the body that can make histamine. These include other immune and blood cells, stomach cells, and specialized nerve cells within the brain and the rest of the body. So if you can take in this slide, this is the problem with histamine intolerance. With one molecule, you have 4 receptors and 8 different organ systems that can be affected. Histamine has a staggering array of effects on the body depending on where it's being released. And so you can see from this slide, it affects the respiratory tract. You get asthma symptoms. It affects the skin. So you get itching and hives. It can create cardiac arrhythmias and even coronary artery spasm. Central nervous system, it can trigger adrenaline release. I won't talk there. So in any case, it has gastrointestinal system. The uterus, it actually can stimulate contraction of the uterus. So it's no wonder then that people have such a strange variety of symptoms when they have histamine intolerance. So we've just talked about where histamine comes from within the body and what its purpose is. But really what I'm here to talk about is the histamine that we have control over, which is the histamine that we take into our bodies in food. So histamine from outside the body comes from bacteria. So that can either be intentionally cultured gourmet foods like meat and cheese and wine and kimchi, or it can be foods that have been exposed to bacteria over time, sitting on your kitchen counter or at a picnic, or even left in the refrigerator for too long because histamine will continue to be reproduced at refrigerator temperatures. So Mother Nature expects us to come into contact with some histamine in our daily life, and so she has armed us with a defense mechanism. So this is the lining of the small intestine, the cells. This is the bloodstream, and this is the lumen of the gut. And so we are actually constantly secreting from our intestinal epithelial cells this neutralizing enzyme called DAO, or diamine oxidase. Diamine oxidase attaches to histamine that comes through from our food, and we are able to neutralize it before most of it gets across and into the bloodstream. So it's a really lovely system, as long as you don't eat too much histamine, because the system can be overwhelmed in any person, not just people with histamine intolerance. There's only so much we can do. So it's there to protect us because we don't want histamine randomly accumulating in the bloodstream. People with histamine intolerance, well, there are many causes. The prime cause, the most important cause, is DAO deficiency. So we don't have enough DAO to mop up the histamine that we're eating. And so quite a bit of it can get through into the bloodstream. Now there is this other enzyme, HNMT, histamine and methyltransferase, which is an intracellular enzyme that's Primarily, HNMT throughout the body is really there to destroy the histamine that we've created ourselves, not so much what we've taken in. So it doesn't do a very good job of getting the rest of the histamine. And also, if you have any problems with your tight junctions, of course, histamine can just slip right between the cells. So some of the possible causes of histamine intolerance, the biggest cause is gastrointestinal compromise. Anything that damages temporarily or permanently the delicate lining of the gastrointestinal tract, particularly in the small intestine, can cause either temporary or permanent difficulties generating DAO, our neutralizing enzyme. So this includes things like Crohn's disease and even temporary infections of the gut. Celiac disease and chemotherapy can cause temporary trouble with histamine. It's very uncommon to have genetically low levels of DAO, and since I'm talking about food sensitivities, most people develop these later on in life. For most people, this is not a genetic issue, it's an acquired issue. Now, DAO requires vitamin B6, vitamin C, copper, and zinc in order to work properly. So it could be that you have plenty of DAO, but you are deficient in one or more of these cofactors, and so it's important to make sure that if you're having symptoms that you're getting enough of these nutrients. And then there's small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, which we'll come to in just a little bit, actually right now. So what I want you to think about on this slide is, when we were saying that there are two sources of histamine in the world. One is food and the other is bacteria. So here, you don't have to eat histamine to be exposed to histamine, because bacteria in your gut can create histamine out of undigested protein. DAO, the neutralizing enzyme, is present throughout the small intestine. So orange is being used to indicate where DAO is in your gastrointestinal tract. It's located throughout the small intestine, but then when you enter the large intestine, it starts to drop off pretty quickly, and there's very little DAO in the majority of the colon. So let's say that you eat a food that contains a protein that's not very well digested, and it makes it all the way down to the colon. Let's say you eat a grain or a bean or a seed or a nut or casein. All these things are gluten. All these things are difficult to digest. And if they make it all the way down to the colon where there's no DAO protection, the bacteria that live in the colon, which, by the way, are extremely high in numbers in the colon compared to in the small intestine, they'll have a field day with that protein and create large amounts of histamine. It's unclear how much of that can be absorbed through the colon, but it is very clear from scientific studies that it can create, for example, diarrhea, because it can create colon spasm. So the other issue is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, if there's too much bacteria in the small intestine, it can be digesting the food that you're supposed to be digesting and turn the proteins in the food you're eating into histamine. So bacteria, many varieties of bacteria in the environment as well as in our gut, contain the very same enzyme that we have, histidine decarboxylase, and so they can transform histidine into histamine. So the average person in this room who doesn't have histamine intolerance can tolerate maybe 50 to 100 milligram per kilogram concentration of histamine in food. People with histamine intolerance can't handle that much, and some can only handle a very small amount. As with everything in life, it varies from person to person. Only you can know what your limit is. But the problem is, what we can't know is how much histamine is in food. No matter how many tables you look at or how many scientific studies you read, every table will present a range for any particular food, because the amount of histamine and other biogenic amines that are in foods depends entirely on too many variables. So how, the processing method, the type of bacteria that the food was exposed to, packaging, and transportation time. There's just no way to know for sure. Unless you have a chemistry lab in your kitchen, you don't know how much histamine is in your food. So you have to just understand the principles, and that will help you figure out which foods to avoid if you're worried about this. So here are just some examples. Most plant foods are naturally very low in histamine, because most plant foods are low in proteins, or at least even the high protein plant foods it's hard for the bacteria to get at them, things like seeds. So most plant foods are naturally low in histamine. There are a few exceptions. But if you ferment them on purpose, like with cabbage, you get much, much higher levels of histamine. Dairy products which are cultured for a very long time, like ripe cheeses, can have enormous amounts of histamine in them, as opposed to dairy products which are cultured for smaller periods of time. The fresher cultured dairy is much lower in histamine. And then some meats, dry sausages, for example, can contain very high levels of histamine. Some alcoholic beverages do contain histamine. Red wine varies from 0 up to 24, again, depending on how it's processed. And champagne tends to be high in histamine for whatever reason. Vinegar is actually not very high, which surprised me. And chocolate, you know, in order to produce chocolate, the cocoa beans are fermented as part of the production process to make. So some chocolate does have histamine. And very interestingly, I came across a paper that explained that organic dark chocolate, in almost every case, was very low in histamine compared to conventional chocolate because of the quality of the methods used to produce the food. So these are the 3 plant foods that are higher in the parent amino acid histidine, and so they're more likely to accumulate histamine over time. So that's why they're on this list. But again, most plant foods are fairly safe. And then there are some fish which are extremely high in histidine, the parent amino acid. And these fish, if they have not been handled properly, stored properly, not eaten fresh, they can accumulate levels of histamine up to over 500 milligrams per kilogram and cause a condition called scombroid poisoning, which is very unpleasant. If anybody's ever had spoiled fish, you'll feel very sick for about 24 hours. And then there's this nebulous area of histamine trigger foods. And so all of these foods may or may not have any histamine of their own or very much or even very much histidine in them necessarily, but they're suspected of triggering our own cells to release histamine. And so some people with histamine intolerance need to be careful with some or all of these foods. Getting at the science behind this is impossible. I haven't been able to find any good reference that explains exactly what's going on with these foods. So as you can imagine, due to the nature of histamine and the nature of food production, getting at this diagnosis can be a little challenging. Again, because of all these different kinds of symptoms that you can have. First of all, how many people would even suspect that some of these symptoms could be related to a food sensitivity? Most people, it wouldn't even occur to them to make that connection. So there is skepticism in some medical professionals and researchers because not all the studies line up perfectly. There's definitely enough information in the scientific literature to have convinced me and many other people this is very real. But if you pick and choose your studies, you can question the data. And so this review article from a few years ago says a lot more is being alleged than is actually substantiated, and that's actually true of all food intolerances. I'm sure most people in this room know that it can be hard to prove some of these things. It doesn't mean they're not real. I believe they are real. I'm convinced by the science and also by my own personal experience. And also, I wrote 2 very detailed articles about histamine intolerance on my website, and people write in and share their experiences. This woman, Victoria, wrote in and said, after a bout of angioedema, which is like allergic swelling, puffiness of the skin, food allergy tests all negative, I went on a low-histamine diet and the rest of my health problems went away, including some things I never expected. No more cramps, headaches, or blemishes. And that's interesting. And this gentleman, SS, wrote in, I'd noticed myself experiencing tachycardia, that's racing heart, anxiety and swelling of my ear canals almost immediately after eating certain foods. Fortunately, ever since eliminating histamine-rich foods from my diet, these symptoms have abated. And you hear things like this all the time. Is there anybody in the room who feels they have histamine intolerance? Just out of curiosity? Oh, quite a few, actually. Yeah. So one of the problems with trying to diagnose and document and research this phenomenon is that histamine intolerance is not just about histamine. Even if you knew exactly how much histamine was in a food and you knew exactly what your tolerance was, you could still run into issues because it's not just about histamine. It's also about all the other biogenic amines that histamine runs with. So Histamine is not found in nature in isolation. Bacteria create lots of different kinds of enzymes, and they are degrading all kinds of other amino acids, not just histidine, and they're creating lots of other biogenic amines. And so two of my favorites are putrescine and cadaverine, which I have lovingly nicknamed Smelly and Spooky. So histamine is always found with these and other biogenic amines. The problem with putrescine and cadaverine in particular is that they inhibit your DAO neutralizing enzyme. So if you're eating a food that you don't think it has much histamine in it, well, how much putrescine does it have in it? How much cadaverine does it have in it? There's no way for you to know that at home. Alcohol, even alcoholic beverages that don't contain any histamine, inhibit DAO. And so that's another issue. And there are many medications which inhibit DAO as well. All of these on this slide inhibit DAO. The ones in red are more commonly taken. And I want to really highlight the NSAIDs, the non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, medicines like Aleve and Advil. Some of these medications can inhibit DAO for weeks after you take them. So another problem with histamine intolerance, it's just true for so many things in life, unfortunately, is more common in women. And this is probably because estrogen and histamine affect each other. Estrogen raises histamine levels, and histamine raises estrogen levels. This is really unfortunate because estrogen levels tend to be highest during ovulation and just before first day of your period, and so that's when your histamine levels will be at their highest, and histamine can trigger uterine contraction. So histamine can be a major player in some premenstrual and perimenopausal symptoms that we don't normally think of as food-related. So, some women might think as they're entering midlife, oh, I must just be starting menopause early. I must be having a lot more difficulty than I used to. And it could just be that they're developing histamine intolerance. And if they took some of these foods out of their diet, they might feel better. But your saving grace if you're a woman is if you get pregnant, you will be spared all the misery of histamine intolerance because the placenta secretes an enormous amount of DAO into the mother's bloodstream in order to protect the fetus. And really, primarily what it's protecting the fetus from, among many other things, is uterine contraction and miscarriage. So when a woman has histamine intolerance, if she becomes pregnant, she has no histamine intolerance symptoms after month 3 until the time of delivery. So I sometimes wonder whether this should be called histamine intolerance. Sorry for that. So the diagnosis is obviously very difficult, and you have to rule out all kinds of other things. What if it's not histamine? What if you react to cheese because you have a dairy issue and it's not the histamine? You have to rule out other food intolerances and allergies, medication reactions, and a rare genetic condition called mastocytosis is out there. It is really quite rare. Some clinicians do like to test for it, but it's usually not the culprit. There are diagnostic tests for histamine intolerance. None of them are perfect. You can test, one of the reasons why there's skepticism around some of the literature is because some of the clinical studies use serum DAO levels, and serum DAO levels are very unreliable. The levels are very low and unstable. You get a lot of false negatives. And that, because most of the DAO in your body is located in the lumen of the gut, which you really can't test for it there. There is some in the kidney and the liver, but there's not a lot of it in the bloodstream to begin with. Logically this makes sense. There's an excellent test you would think would be to take somebody who suspects histamine intolerance, put them on a low histamine diet for a period of time, a couple of weeks or so, and then give them pure histamine liquid, 75 milligrams, and see if they have a reaction. Now, you would think that would be an excellent test, but you get a lot of false negatives there, and the reason is because we don't encounter pure histamine in nature. We encounter histamine in combination with other biogenic amines and often alcohol and medications, and histamine can also accumulate over time in a person, so 75 milligrams may not be enough to elicit a reaction. It just doesn't replicate what's going on in the real world. If you really wanted to know, you could do a biopsy, but that's rarely used. It's expensive and it's invasive. You could look at your DAO levels in your gut. The best clinical test seems to be a skin prick test where you inject histamine under the skin and you wait 50 minutes, which is longer than a usual skin prick test. Thank you. If you wait 50 minutes and look for the swelling, the wheals, and that's about 80% reliable. But for my money, and this is again true for all food intolerances, the gold standard is really if you improve on a low histamine diet, and if you get worse when you put histamine back into your diet. This is actually a copy of my own journal from years ago. Keep a log of your symptoms and what you were eating, and see if you notice any patterns. If you suspect you may have histamine intolerance, you want to try to eat a low histamine diet. And what that means, there's actually no such thing as a zero histamine diet. There are some people out there who say, oh, you should just eat potatoes and rice. First of all, I don't recommend that for a lot of reasons. But there really is no such thing as zero histamine because bacteria are all around us. So you avoid all the aged and fermented and cultured foods. You may want to also avoid those few fresh foods that are high in the parent amino acid histidine. Avoid histamine trigger foods, at least at first, and see how you do. And avoid alcohol because it inhibits DAO. The two problems with histamine, one is you can't see it, you can't smell it, and you can't taste it. So you have no idea how much is in your food just by doing those things you might normally do to check to see if a food is fresh or spoiled. And the other problem is you cannot get rid of histamine. Once it has formed, it is literally impossible to destroy it. So if you were to buy a fresh piece of fish or a fresh piece of meat and it takes you a while to get home, you really want to put it immediately on ice because that will slow down the bacterial enzymatic activity. And you want to cook it or freeze it as soon as you get home. And if you cook it, you want to eat it or freeze it shortly thereafter. Because you can't destroy the bacteria that are creating the histamine. You can't destroy them by cooking or freezing. They will spring back to life and speed back up as soon as you bring the food back to room temperature. So if you freeze the food for a week or two, that will destroy the enzyme, but it doesn't destroy the histamine and it doesn't destroy the bacteria. Cooking destroys the enzyme, but doesn't destroy the histamine or the bacteria. So when you're buying meat, especially avoid these vacuum-packed meats, which are designed to have a shelf life of something like a couple of weeks in this case. If you don't know when it was packaged, you might want to ask. Even with fresh meats at a butcher shop or in the grocery store, try to find out if you can how fresh something is. Local meats and fish and poultry tend to be fresher, not always, but that's often useful to know. And paradoxically, frozen is often safer than fresh for all meat, fish, and poultry products. Frozen at sea seafood, if you can find it, is really ideal because fish spoils very quickly. It takes a long time to get it in from the ocean. Besides diet, the other thing you can do is you could consider supplementing nutrients that you may be deficient in, or make sure your diet contains those, even better. Some people take antihistamines or mast cell stabilizing medications after the fact, or if they don't want to change their diet, or if they've accidentally eaten something with histamine in it. They can be helpful if you can tolerate them. But my preferred strategy is to if I'm not sure, if I'm going out to eat and I'm not sure, how much histamine might be in something, I can take a DAO supplement on occasion. They're expensive, so I try not to use them very often, but they do help, and they're quite safe. So really the take-home message, what I want you to take home in your doggy bag from Boulder is just to eat food as fresh as you possibly can find it. And I think it's just a good rule of thumb anyway as a human being to eat fresh food. And this is a very huge topic with a lot of complicated side topics that can grow out of it. There are 2 articles on my website which are very detailed, so you're welcome to look there. And all of the information that was in this talk is also on those blog posts. And but I'm also very happy to answer any questions you might have now. So thank you very much.
This is probably close enough. I don't really have a question exactly, but my name is Sean Baker, and
Hi, Sean.
I actually lived in Massachusetts all my life until I moved here to Boulder, Colorado in March of last year. And I was in the wine industry for several years, and I spent from 1993 on, I was actually in the Pioneer Valley and lived in Northampton on 2 separate occasions, and spent a lot of time there. And
You'll be sorely missed.
Well, and my ex-wife opened a store, which was basically a histamine store because it sold wine, craft beer, cheese, and cured meats called Provisions. In downtown
I love
Northampton.
that store.
Yeah, you do?
Yes,
I
do.
Can you eat there? What can you eat there?
I just love that store.
And I was a big part actually of the organizing, even though I didn't end up being an owner. Anyways, being in the wine industry, we would hear from people all the time. People would come in and say that they were sensitive to sulfites. And for us in the wine industry, we had to just sit there and usually just bite our tongues or roll our eyes. Or sometimes you explain to the people that you probably have a histamine intolerance. And if you took a Benadryl, not that we're suggesting that you take a Benadryl while you're drinking, you would probably see those symptoms disappear. And so I thought that was interesting too, that you mentioned that not only is the alcohol could potentially contain histamines, and I actually thought it would be higher than that, and the difference between red wines, like still wines, and champagne was kind of baffling actually, because being in the wine industry, I don't see what part of the process would cause that.
Right.
But that it's also a DAO inhibitor.
Yes.
I found that to be extremely
I did too. It's
Yeah.
something I didn't know until I really dug into it, but the histamine store.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so a lot of food sensitivities are complicated because there's so many different things within any food that affecting our chemistry. So unless it's just plain very fresh meat, I'm always suspicious.
Right.
I don't trust vegetables or anything else really.
Yeah. Right. Well, thank you for your presentation.
Well, thank you very much for your question.
Hi, thanks. Very informative. So two-part question. One, is this something that you're basically on a low-histamine diet your entire life? That's it? And secondly, have you experimented with probiotics, gut microbiome stuff in terms of how that may influence your histamine tolerance or lack thereof?
That's really good questions. Thank you. The first is, I don't know if this is asceticism or what going on for me, but I prefer to do elimination rather than try to add things back. I did try probiotics years ago. I wish I could tell you which ones. They didn't seem to do anything for me. I had a lot of gastrointestinal symptoms, IBS symptoms of every kind you can think of years ago. And what actually ended up working for me was taking things out of my diet rather than adding things in like fermented foods or probiotics. And I mean, I feel amazing now, but that's probably not going to be true for everybody, of course. I do think that once you develop this, unless you can figure out what it is what the underlying cause is, if you can figure out what it is that's damaging your day. Like I talked to somebody this week, Larissa actually, who had said that, she thought she might have had some histamine issues with particular foods. And then when she removed other things from her diet, like gluten, for example, her tolerance went up. And so I do think that that's true for people, that they can find ways to improve their gut health, and that should raise their threshold. I don't know if it ever would completely, maybe for some people it would completely resolve their symptoms. And, I kind of know where my limit is, and, it just gives me more control. So it doesn't mean that I can never eat these things. It just means that I know what the consequences will be. Exactly.
Great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi.
Hi.
Have you considered much traditional diets like Southern Italians that eat almost every food that you listed on there? If you come from that ethnicity, are you less susceptible to histamine intolerance?
I haven't come across anything like that. My theory about it is that all of us are hopefully born with the ability to tolerate histamine very well, and then we damage our gut lining, and then it's destroyed. And so any number of things, pesticides, post-agricultural foods, processed foods, who knows. But I think that that's probably what's going on, because we are designed to handle some naturally. You can see that because we have this built-in defense mechanism. So
yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah, sure. Hi.
Hello. When you mentioned that it's, synergizes with estrogen, and of course this, like so many other things, are more prevalent in women, And then the thing you said about pregnancy, have you ever in your travels heard of anybody supplementing progesterone, which is really the biggest difference between like the PMS versus the pregnant hormone
That is
balance in a
very
woman?
interesting. I don't, I mean, you'd need a placenta to create the DAO. You mean, I'm sorry, maybe I'm misunderstanding your question.
Well, the placenta produces a lot of progesterone, and I think that in and of itself opposes the estrogen,
Oh, I see what you're saying.
as well as increases endogenous production of a lot of
I
things,
see.
probably these histamine metabolizing.
Thank you. Now I
enzymes.
understand your question now. Sorry. I have not come across anything like that, but that's really interesting to think about.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
Well, actually, I have one question myself, so you're not off the hook yet. You didn't mention anything about bone broth, and I've read that bone broth is another source of high histamine, and I was wondering if that's actually true, and if so, is it because something about the process of making bone broth, or is it the starting ingredients? If you have bones from animals that were, since the butchering, they've been sitting around and accumulated histamine, and that's why it's in there. Could you comment on that?
That's a great question. A lot of people have continued writing to my website with that very same question. I don't know where this idea came from that bone broth is supposed to be higher in histamine, because when I really looked into it, when someone wrote in, I actually dug up papers about, cooking temperatures and all of this kind of stuff. If you have fresh bones and you make your broth and you either eat it or freeze it right away, there's no reason that I can think of why bone broth should be any more susceptible to histamine than anything else.
Can I just comment on that?
Oh, please.
Because I have some degree of histamine intolerance as well, and I eat a lot of bone broth, and it usually doesn't seem to affect me.
Excellent.
But one time I did make bone broth out of some bones that were a lot older, and a variety of them, so I don't know which ones exactly it was. And it was so extreme that I had this at work, and I had to go home. I had an immediate headache. My face flushes. That's one of my main symptoms.
Wow.
And so I think it is just probably about the quality of what went in and how old that is. Because as you said, it can't be destroyed by cooking.
Exactly. Oh, that's really interesting. Thank you for sharing that.